Good evening. It's April 14th, 2020. This is the first Tuesday in Holy Week. I'm Joe with you from First Presbyterian Church in Smithfield, North Carolina today. I want to share with you that as we have been in this time of quarantine, I have very much enjoyed the opportunity of being with you in these evening reflections. The feedback, the shared commentary, people I haven't heard from in a long time. I do appreciate each and all those, every one of those comments that lets me know that in some small way I'm trying to help. And I'll tell you up front, in the beginning, I only had one purpose, was to share with you during a time of quarantine words of encouragement, scriptural affirmations about our faith and God's love for us, and as well maybe gain more insight into the story of God through people of faith who've experienced things much like ourselves during these times. Uh, there is no plan for my part, but I trust that God has a plan of God's own. It's probably strange, but time itself has been my challenge today. I'm not surprised in the least that we can look in Genesis and see that it was God who created time, that time, like every other part of creation, is something that serves God's own purposes. Today, for me, has been one of those days I've actually had to check outside sources to be sure of when and where I am. On social media, there are a number of memes circulating that are pretty amusing, saying that today in quarantine is March the 94th. Or for me, it's been April the umpteenth all day. I just have to keep going back and checking. These weeks in quarantine, however, these days that some seem longer than others, are truthfully no different than they were in other times when we were busy about our work, when things seemed to move much more quickly, perhaps, and our lifestyles were more hectic. But the perception of time, this flow of time, has not changed at all. In fact, this may be the more normal way of being as God intended it, sort of like an extended Sabbath or an extended 40 days in the wilderness. Now, I will acknowledge up front, for a very small few of us who are isolated and lonely, this day, these weeks are very much like the days that went before. And we remember there is a need for all of us there to reach out, to care, and to love one another, and in turn, be receptive to the grace that others offer. But for many of us, I'm a person who goes to work. I have tasks to do, people to call, emails to answer. I tend to benefit from structure in uh, really good ways that help me get from moment to moment. I'm a person who works very well with chronological time and the way things flow that takes me from moment to moment. So this time is unsettling for me, and I'm sure many of you have experienced that. But we're experiencing a different kind of time. I think what I have often referred and shared with many of you that we call God's time. In relation to the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, I've spoken of the eternal now. A good friend of mine who is Catholic, Joe, shared that with me, being on the same time as the saints who were, who are, and who are yet to come. I speak of God's time when we keep vigil by the bedside of a loved one who is near death and not knowing when, where, or how, but just being present to that person as we make our final goodbyes. But the idea of God's time is far wider. It is part of the great mystery. The flow of God's time is in part of sharing in the biblical story and mixing it with our prayers. It's the giving and receiving of communion in the presence of God. It's the breathing in and the breathing out of life, the ebb and flow of time itself. I believe the lessons we're learning now is about what it means to live on God's time. Writer Lauren Pinellas, back about 9 years ago, shared an article about the nature of time and being on God's time. She begins with a quote from Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus in chapter 5. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of time because the days are evil. She continues, in our zeal to be good stewards of time, we can miss the wisdom that the Bible has to offer us. We end up running headlong down a path that we think is correct, but we just get further away from where we should be. Such is the case with the Greek concepts of time, chronos and kairos. I'm a chronos kind of person, chronological, that we do this at this hour and time flows from point A to point B and there's no upsetting that flow. It's artificial in many ways. It's something that is part of the creation. The New Testament also speaks of kairos time. They both mean the same as time in Greek, but kairos has more of the nature of appointed season and circumstances and times. We know in kairos time that we have an opportunity, a window, that when someone is sick, we need to go and be there with them. When someone is hungry, there's an opportunity to feed them. When someone calls to you, when there's a knock on the door, there's a choice before us. And that is what Kairos time and this appointed time is for us now. In Hebrew, the root of that New Testament word, when we look back at the older scriptures, is from et. And it is a word that speaks to these appointed seasons. Many of us are familiar with the Bird Song from the 1960s, originally written by Pete Seeger, but Pete himself quoted from words that were far more ancient, ones he was ready to give credit to, from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and I'd like to share those words with you this evening. For everything there is a season, a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. As I began the reflection tonight, I shared with you my thoughts and ideas. They continue to flow into new paths, into new understandings and new ways of being, even before the sun goes down. What I started out with in the beginning of the day becomes something quite different by the time I reach this point at night. I invite you all to continue to join me for these evening reflections as I hope to be able to share with you some little known, obscure, but very powerful biblical stories of wisdom, folly, and heroic faith, stories of wise women, talking jackasses, it's in Numbers, look it up, sly foxes that Jesus rebukes, and freezing time itself in a cosmological sense. I'd like to close tonight with this affirmation of faith from Ecclesiastes, words attributed to King Solomon 3,000 years ago. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already is, and God seeks out what has gone by. May the light, the love, and the peace of Christ be with you all until we gather again. Good night.